Chapter 71. Black Witches. Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Raising her hand gingerly, she took hold of the glass tube. Not applying much pressure on it as she was scared that it would end up breaking, similar to how the last one had shattered in her hands. She was sure she had done nothing and it had broken by itself, but how could a glass break by itself? Her hand was gentle around the glass tube. Damien's eyes shifted from her hand to the potion inside. Zeroing on the liquid, how does it feel holding the glass? And changes, he asked her seriously. Penny, who had been used to Damien's eyes and every single facial expression being covered in mischief and sarcasm at times. Seeing him like this felt somewhat daunting. His whole persona had changed to a serious one. Gulping softly, Penny answered, "It feels cold. Cold like the snow," and it was true, but then the temperature started to shift like cold water that was being placed under the fire. It's changing. The liquid that was transparent started to turn its color like an invisible bubble that had suddenly burst to let itself mingle and turn the tube completely green in color. Seeing Penny's eyebrows furrow with the amount of heat that had begun to gather inside it, he grabbed the tube from her hand, feeling the hot liquid. On a closer look, he saw the glass was going to break, but it didn't. "These potions are very special, Penny. Don't go touching things that you have no business in." His words were curt and Penny nodded her head in understanding. "This one here is a potion that has been brewed by one of our very special people." His voice shifted to the kind she was used to, the atmosphere feeling lighter, which didn't feel like she was suffocating with his overbearing presence. She wondered what that was about. "L.C. from the councilman?" asked Penny unsurely. "Wasn't it the witches who were associated with the making of potions?" Damien turned to place the green tube that didn't break, which he placed in the cushion. "Unfortunately, we don't have any witches who work for us directly. When the council was formed, the first Councilman Callahan Vahuan, who founded the council, had drawn the line where witches were never supposed to step in and around the perimeters. You do know we have two kinds of witches, right?" Damien had locked the box, taking it to one of his closets and placing it inside it. "The white and the black witches." "Good girl," he praised her airily, walking around the room as he said, "as much as some wanted to let in the white witches to work with the councilman due to their potential skills and some holding the ability of divination, a lot opposed the idea due to the variability they possess. Anyways, getting back to the topic, these are creations of the black witches. At least that is what many of yous think, unless," paused Damien with his words and his actions, turning to look at her to say, "it is done by a black sheep." "You think it is a white witch," whispered Penny for him to give her a broad smile. "What a smart mouse you are. I will be sure to give you a piece of cheese." A lot of us often believe what we see without seeing what is there deep down in a person. Don't you think so? Penny tried to keep up with his words, wondering if she was following right or if she was exhausted with the worry of him throwing her into the sea as her punishment. "I heard a whisper long ago. Words that spoke about a white witch who was corrupted like the vampires, which is how she came to be a black witch, but then there is a lot of folklore when it comes to the existence of the black witches." Penny, not understanding it, asked, "Corrupted?" He responded back to her, "Pure-blooded vampires, and vampires can't be killed as easy as the humans. So most of them use vampires to turn against each other. Less labor and a lot of productivity that way," said Damien as if he were the one recruiting the people while trying to stringent with his money. "Corruption in vampires is like a disease that can spread by one person being infected. These potions have still not been tested and need to be sent to the laboratory of the council tomorrow." "Now that the box is safe," he said, coming to stand a few steps away from where she stood, "how shall I punish you for doing something you were not supposed to do?" he asked her, giving a glance towards the floor where even Penny looked down. Penny knew this was coming. If he left this opportunity of not punishing her, this wouldn't be Damien Quinn at all. "I will remove the glass pieces that are on the floor and clean the room spotless," offered Penny, hoping he would agree to it. Damien waved his hand with a bored look. "I can ask Falcon to get a maid to clean it. For someone who tried to damage something that belongs to the council, offering to clean the room." He rolled his eyes. "What else? Please don't throw me out," said Penny, hoping he wouldn't come to it. Damien stared at her for a few seconds before bursting into laughter. Don't worry about it, little mouse. I have something much better than you swimming in the cold sea like a dead fish. Saying this, Damien walked to the bedside. Bending down to pull out the drawers before he picked a little book which must have contained not more than 20 pages in there. Penny wondered what it was. Coming to walk around where she was, he said, this is your punishment. Penny wasn't good with words, or at least not well versed except for a few things, but looking at the design and the way the title read, her eyes widened. No, she whispered in her mind. It was a playbook that was often given to the audience or the viewers who came to the theater. You are going to enact the side female character for me. Damien's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. Chapter 72. Not in the script. Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. What happened? Don't tell me that you can't act a simple play like this, said Damien, going to his bed and taking a seat at the center as if he were readying himself, taking a comfortable position and picking a pillow from the side that he placed on his lap. Don't tell me the famous Penelope of the theater Arison, Ava, doesn't know how to act. This man had really made a good background check about her, thought Penny to herself. The question was, when did he even have the time to do it? All this while he was always around in the mansion or in the room, unless he was sneaking out like a cat in the middle of the night after she was asleep. She doubted that was the case. Master Damien, have we met before? She asked him apprehensively, already knowing what the answer was going to be. Does it matter? Now quick, he rubbed his hands together, pick Annabeth's line from page 5 as there's nothing in the first few pages, more than guiding, he ordered her, waiting for her to start. Penny, who had been working in the theater before moving in with her relative's family, was someone who had often looked up to be the female lead, which she never got to take part in. Instead, it was always the smaller roles. She did get a few side roles which were of importance. Already having heard and read about the play as she was part of the theater, Penny didn't know why her master was interested in her playing the side character who wasn't the female lead of the play. Like many stories, Annabeth was a human, but her character was a little different than the sweet and attractive heroine of the story. She was one of the characters Penny had never taken up and wasn't that eager to play, due to which Penny had never taken up the role even when it was offered. She shifted around, with her fingers pushing the pages until she came to the 5th page, which was the entrance of her character. Do you want me to take a nap before you start so that you can learn the lines? He asked her, putting a slightly sad face, which was a false pretense. Penny wasn't going to fall for it, but with the word punishment hanging like an axe on her neck, this wasn't that bad, she said to herself. At least she wasn't going to be standing in the rain with her getting drenched. Penny didn't have to go through the lines as she already knew most of it. And did it matter if he liked it or not? It wasn't as if he was her customer or part of the audience. When she started to clear her throat, she heard him say, "Go there. You can start from there," he directed her. Turning around, Penny walked to the far corner of the room. Clearing her throat again, she started to walk in, her head held up high, with the book rolled in her hand as if it were a weapon. "Where is Mr. Scrivener?" she spoke loudly, her head moving left and right. She tried bringing some tears in her eyes. Bringing out tears wasn't that hard for her, but with Damien Quinn sitting there looking at her like a child-like expression which she hadn't seen before caught her off guard, that she lost the ability to tear up at the scene. The scene was where the hero of the story had jilted his fiancée, which Penny was right now playing. Taking the bedpost to be the person, she looked up at it. "Please don't leave me, Mr. Scrivener. You promised me when you bought me the flowers that you would stay by my side." "Where did I say that?" said Damien, suddenly jumping into the scene which Penny had not expected. But, stammered Penny, who had with great difficulty tried to remember the lines which now felt lost. "But what? Where did the flowers say I promised a wedding?" asked Damien, filling up the hero's role while still sitting on the bed. He waved his hand for her to continue. "Does it mean the flowers meant nothing to you? Us meeting under the peach tree only for you to blow away my words like the wind? Why would you do that, Mr. Scrivener? Did my feelings mean nothing to you?" asked Penny, feeling a little strange that she had now shifted her gaze from the bedpost to look at Damien. She waited for 2 seconds wondering if he would chip in his words here, but seeing that he wasn't, she continued to say, I have given my love to you since I have seen you. Though we didn't like each other in the beginning, I have come to like you with your sweet gestures. I thought. What did you think? Came the curt voice of Damien, who changed his voice slightly, pushing the pillow away from him and stepping down from the bed. Tell me. Mr. Scrivener. Penny took a step back. Forgetting the lines, she flipped the pages quickly to read what was next. Falling down on the floor dramatically, she hid her face to say, do you even need to ask? She asked even more dramatically, which made Damien chuckle, a genuine one that came out by looking at her. Penny made strange noises as if she were crying loudly, sniffing and shaking her head. Oh, I am so lost in this world now. The person I believed to be the one for me is now getting married to another woman. Was I not good enough? Bringing tears in her eyes felt less difficult as she didn't face Damien right now. For some odd reason, bringing the false tears was hard in front of him, and it made her feel that she was lying, which she evidently was, as it was all an act. Chapter 73. Not in the script. Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Damien walked to where she was. I apologize if something I have told has misled you, but we only met under the peach tree once, which was to give you a letter that was to be passed to your brother, and as he was reciting his lines, Penny, who was on the floor, read what was there in the playbook, making sure she was getting the lines right. The next line in the script of playbook read, Annabeth snaps her head, looking at Mr. Scrivener with tear-filled eyes. The plays were always dramatic, thought Penny to herself. She snapped her head, her eyes meeting Damien's. It does not justify the flowers and the touch on my hand. Forget it. Damien was impressed that Penny had the ability to bring tears in her eyes, but the moment it met his eyes, the tears started to evaporate, letting only her jade green eyes sparkle under the light of the room. Bending down, he then said, Forget what? Penny looked up at him at the change of his voice. Looking at the playbook to see that wasn't the next line. The next line was supposed to be, Mr. Scrivener decides to leave Miss Annabeth on stage so that he can go meet his fiancée. That. Penny wanted to tell him that he was saying it all wrong, and also wondered if he skipped to the next parts, not that she could remember any of it. Damien sat down on his heels, looking at her. Don't say forget it when you have only now confessed your feelings for me. Master Damien, that's not in the play. He must have confused it with another play, thought Penny to herself, for him to sigh. Do you know how long I have waited for you to tell me these words? His voice dropped to a whisper. He placed his hand on her face, and Penny turned to a block of ice, her eyes not moving away from his eyes even for a second. Seeing that he was making up his own lines without admitting that the great Master Damien had forgotten the lines, she decided to play along. What do you mean? She asked, to play safe. What do you think it has been, you foolish girl? In another instance, Penny would have narrowed her eyes for calling her that, but in their current scene, it seemed to have filled somewhere with unexpressed love which Penny had believed to be non-existent, and an incapable feeling this man could conjure. You took my attention since the first time I saw you. Your beautiful smile and your eyes, the words you have spoken. I remember every one of them. Like a personal diary that I have been saving in my mind. Though Damien had been mean to her most of the time, his words struck into her, which was often possible while playing the characters and immersing in their stories on stage. He was a good actor. Thought Penny to herself, at the same time his features and expressions that were breaking free from his usual demeanor made her chest feel queasy. His red eyes looked at her lazily, his pale lips uttering the made-up lines one after another. His black hair was disheveled, some of them coming to fall on his forehead. Testing the waters while interested what this part of the story had, she asked, What do you remember? How can I believe a man who said a few minutes ago of not claiming to have made the unspoken promise? She asked him, gulping in the end when his hand picked the piece of hair to feel it from the top till the end before letting it go. Think what you may, but that doesn't change the fact that you have taken my interest. The answer felt more like how Damien himself would answer, by evading and choosing to ignore the questions asked. Tell me, said Penny, still playing Annabeth, sitting up more properly so that she wouldn't get a possible backache with the odd position she had been sitting in right now. Why do you need to know? For someone who doesn't believe in the person they have feelings for, he harumphed, turning to look away from her as if in disappointment. She didn't know how to go around it anymore as they were way past away from the track of the actual play. She stared at him as if they had paused or the characters were taking time to hear him look back at her, but this time there was something in his eyes. Something unspeakable which made her shiver by the look of it, which was more than daunting to Penny. Damien leaned forward. Look at my actions more closely. I have always chosen you over others. He leaned further close to her. Penny felt her eyes widen at the close proximity they shared with each other. His honey-coated words making her sway. Have I ever hurt you? He asked her, his face coming closer than ever, which made her heart thunder. Master Damien. Penny spoke hurriedly. What is it? Asked Damien, his breath falling on hers. His eyes had lowered down, his head still leaning. Not knowing what to say, Penny's voice came out awkwardly. We are not following the playbook. That story is quite lousy, little mouse. A man with no backbone to refuse nor accept. Penny was feeling slightly dizzy. Thankfully Damien did pull away from her where she could again breathe as she had stopped breathing. I have to say you are a decent actress. You aren't bad yourself, Master Damien, she complimented him back, standing up after he stood up, making her dress proper. What do you mean bad enough? I am excellent. No doubt there, he took the compliment generously. Damien went to sit on the edge of the bed as he placed both his hands behind him, leaning back to stare at her. Penny stared back at him before moving her eyes not so subtly to look at the fireplace which had burned ashes in them. Chapter 74. Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Silence filled the room where Penny avoided Damien and instead occupied herself looking at the fireplace before placing her eyes on the playbook in her hand. At least there was something to drive away from the awkward silence which had been created after Damien and Penny played something that was not part of the actual play. He wasn't wrong though. The man Mr. Scrishner was a spineless man in the play who was indecisive. At first, he wooed Annabeth and then he fell for another woman. The man promised both the woman where in the end he decided to go with his new love interest. Men like them were really spineless who had no backbone. Who knew that Damien had the ability to act so well? Remembering the closeness of his face that was a few inches away from hers, his breath falling on hers which had her heart thumping loud enough where she was sure he had heard it in the silent room, which was why she was hiding her gaze from him. The cruel master had shown one side of his emotion which had only been part of the play, but she couldn't refuse to not acknowledge that he had done a good job which had caught her attention. Though Penny would have appreciated if he had let her know about them not following the playbook entirely so that she wouldn't have played the character so dramatically. Since when did you start playing in the theater? She heard Damien's voice float to her ears and she turned to look at him. She saw him looking at her, his eyes much relaxed as if the entire view in front of him was sinking and consuming in his eyes. It was 2 years ago. I was a worker in there who had to play a log of a tree. Why a tree? He kept his head to the side. I had only been part of the props where I was delivery items when I was asked to be part of someone's replacement. Damien appeared to be curious about her progress in the theatrical world. How did you get into playing from a log of wood to side characters then? Penny smiled. One of them fell sick and the schedule was tight. I had been there the entire month, enough to learn the little lines which weren't a lot. Just 3 minutes. 3 minutes is a lot, he commented for her to smile. It was true. To be an actor or actress, even a minute on the stage was enough to change the entire course of life. Just that Penny's course of life didn't go the way she wanted it to be. She could have been given the main roles, to be a well-known actress, but before that time could come with a good pay her mother had fallen sick, due to which she had to stop going, or rather was asked to stop coming due to her irregular time where she had to spend time looking after her sick mother. What were your dreams before your mother passed away? Were you hoping to take the lead? Be famous? Asked Damien, his eyes gauging every movement of hers. Just have a roof over mine and my mother's head. Enough food for us to pass the days without having to worry we might not have enough. Respect, she whispered. Did it matter if she spoke about it now though? Few dreams were meant to be dreams, thought Penny to herself. What Penny didn't realize that Damien was an extremely clever pure-blooded vampire. To him, the girl was an open book where he didn't even have to change the page as the page turned itself without knowledge. He could see and imagine how her dreams might have slipped through her fingers. Respect, thought Damien to himself. Penelope wasn't a perfect artist, but given the time maybe she could have had the potential to turn to a star by her hard work where many men and women of different kinds would have willed themselves to come to see her. And though it wasn't late right now, Damien had no intention to have her walk in the same path. It wasn't that he had anything against a person being an actress or an actor, but he didn't like the idea of a stranger or anyone that mattered to have their eyes on this girl. If there was one thing one had to know about Damien Quinn, he didn't share anything with anyone. And this girl here was off the list for anyone that matters. To test her, he asked casually, "Do you want to be part of the theater again?" His eyes carefully looked at her lost expression as if she was thinking about something. Penny wondered if she wanted to be part of it again. I don't know. That's not an answer. It is either a yes or a no, Penny. Damien didn't bother to hint that he was looking for a specific answer. No, she replied back to him for him to nod. Not knowing what was going on in that mind of his, she asked him, "Have you been interested in taking part in the plays?" And the more she thought the more questions arose in her mind. "Do you go to see the plays in the theater?" Her question made him ponder, a mischievous smile falling on his face. "That depends on my mood." "Would you like to be a spectator of the theater?" he asked to receive a surprised look from her. He added, "Not the ones you used to play in. People like us don't go to the theaters like those, but we have other ones." Of course, thought Penny to herself. The pure-blooded vampires and the other high society people had their own world of theater where people like her couldn't even imagine to take part or even take a peek in there. "Is there a deal in here?" she asked skeptically, as there was always one, and Damien doing it things for free was something hard to imagine. Chapter 75. Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Nothing at all. "You doubt me a lot," he chuckled. "You should put some faith in me," he said, his eyes shining bright with mirth. How could she when he was looking at her as if he had planned to murder and dump her on their way to the theater? Penny took the time again to apologize. She bowed her head, this time earning a curious expression from Damien. "I am sorry for the glass tube. I will be mindful next time and not touch anything here." "I am glad to hear it. If you ended up breaking things, especially, that belongs to the council. You and I both will be questioned on it before the council decides to punish you in a way you don't want to imagine," he responded back to her calmly. Penny had only heard about the council being the law that had enforced on the public, but had never got to hear things in depth, which made her curious. Unable to hold in her curiosity that bubbled in her mind, she asked, "What are the punishments passed on to one? Are the councilmen punished too?" "They vary from one mistake to another. Some can be minimal, where a person is starved before being let out. The medium punishments fall from being beaten to starvation, while the worst can either be dead or it can turn to torture, where one will be left screaming to the point where the person will have no energy to let out the screams he or she feels." "Be no calm, worse than the slave establishment?" asked Penny. "Worse than that. But maybe a little less if I think about it," said Damien to her. "You were covered in bruises on your head when the day I bought you." "Did something else happen in the slave establishment when you were in there?" he inquired her. Penny shook her head. "How did you come to have a bruise right up here?" Damien raised his hand to point it to his forehead. Penny's mouth opened as if in realization. "It was the warden." "Seems like you made quite an impression on him," he murmured as if in thought, and then continued to speak. "Frankly, the council and the slave establishment isn't that too different when compared to each other. A lot of unlawful things happen in there, but no one speaks about it. Or it is left ignorant to the others in general. A person can be tortured in the council, but in the same way, people in the slave establishment are beaten, starved, marked with the hot iron rod, while also many who go through to be defiled, Penny already knew that part. I am still impressed that you weren't checked for the slave mark. Be careful not to roam too far away from this place, Penny. Penny didn't know if it were a warning coming from him or to be careful from being caught by the others. I am not going to run away, said Penny, at least not right now. I know. You wouldn't go that far if you tried, though I would love to see you try. Damien smiled at her as if seeing right through her. In 2 days we have my mother's birthday celebration where a lot of people will be coming in. Vampires and humans, some whom you have made an impression with, so stick close to me. The tone in his voice suddenly turned serious as if he was warning her something bad would happen if she strayed too far away. Yes, Master Damien, Penny was not going to go look for trouble. It was the last thing she wanted to do by putting the focus of the cold-blooded creatures on her. Good. Anyways, how long has it been since you last went to visit your mother? Almost a month. I will be going to visit my mother. Do you want to go visit your mother's grave? Penny eagerly nodded her head. Standing up, Damien started to walk towards the door before he said grab the coat. Penny did as she was told and went to grab the coat before following him outside the room. Once Damien had paid his respects to his deceased mother, he took her to the old village which was once a home, or at least a home until her mother passed away, which then turned to hell in a few hours. Stopping the carriage, Penny stepped down. Go on, said Damien, stepping down from the carriage but not planning to walk along with her in there. Compared to the graveyard where Damien's mother was placed, this place was the opposite, where the graves were placed in a cramped position. Trying to place as many bodies as possible in there. There was dirt filled up on the sides where Damien pondered over the lack of cleanliness one had in here, which was the magistrate's job to do. Damien saw Penny walk through the many other tombstones before she came to stand in front of one of them, which he took note of. It had been long since Penny had last visited her mother. She hadn't meant to delay her visit from her mother, but things had been busy. Every time she came to see her mother who laid under this headstone, she was overwhelmed with pain. She had spent a good time with her mother. She was her only family who was there with her, as they only had each other. After spending some more time, where Damien stood outside waiting for her to come back. She bid her mother by, hoping to visit her soon. She wished she could have bought flowers for her, but she wasn't in the position to buy one right now. She was not only penniless but also a slave. It also made her wonder if her mother could see her, would she be proud of still having her head held high? Or would she be ashamed that her daughter had turned to a slave to one of the pure-blooded vampires? Penny didn't know, and with that thought, she went back to where Damien stood. Done, he asked her, to which she nodded her head. Her eyes were slightly wet due to the tears which had threatened to come out of her eyes. Let's take a walk in here. The weather is all nice and cold today. Penny didn't know what Damien had in his mind right now. As they continued to walk, stepping into the village she once used to live in, she could see the villagers watching them like a hawk. People here are very welcoming, said Damien sarcastically as he looked at the people directly in their eyes. The people automatically had to lower their eyes. Not because he was a high social standing man, but his mere clothes and eyes were enough to tell that this man was not someone to be looked down or pass comments at. Damien had a presence that demanded people bow down at him. His eyes instead looked down at the humans, where some held the expression of hate which was not let out verbally. Which was your house? Asked Damien, ignoring the people around until he caught one of the women looking at Penny and twisting her face away in annoyance. It is on the other side of this street. Take me there, he ordered. Penny didn't comment and lead the way to her house. Now that she was finally here, it made her wonder how she had lived amongst these people for all these years. Their eyes had always been unfriendly, but it was only now did she realize after months that how vile they were. She didn't have to know that the villagers not only didn't like Damien's presence in here but also hers. With the rumors of her father that had floated for years, her mother and she were the ones to take the backlash of that one act of her father's disappearance. Coming to stand in front of the house which she once used to live, she said, looking at it, "This is the one. Now that she was finally here, it made her wonder how she had lived amongst these people for all these years. Their eyes had always been unfriendly, but it was only now did she realize after months that how vile they were. She didn't have to know that the villagers not only didn't like Damien's presence in here but also hers. With the rumors of her father that had floated for years, her mother and she were the ones to take the backlash of that one act of her father's disappearance. Coming to stand in front of the house which she once used to live, she said, looking at it, "This is the one." Chapter 76. Round Ball of Waste. Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. It had been too long since she last was here. After her mother's death, Penny had not returned. With her mother gone, there was nothing to return to. With the little essential items that were in the house was sold in the market to the man who sold the items further to others. It was the very money which she had hidden until now safely, at least that's what she thought it to be, in the village where her uncle and aunt resided, which wasn't this one. It felt nostalgic to Penny that she had returned here after months that had passed by. The door was locked, which was obvious, as after Penelope had left the village, the magistrate had taken the house under his department, which was yet to be demolished until something had to be built. But a human village like this, there was no scope for improvement. At least that's what the magistrate and the men one level above the magistrate thought, who didn't lend any money but only took hold of the tax of the people by cheating them and keeping them as poor as possible so that they could fill up their own pockets. Penny didn't know why Damien wanted to come to have a look at where she used to once live. Turning, she looked at Damien, whose eyes were glued on the condition of the house, where the house would break by itself with a few more rains being hit on the roof. Especially rains that belonged to the land of Bone Lake wasn't gentle to houses that weren't built strongly to only let it fall apart in time. Damien, who had his eyes on the house, saw how tattered the house was. His blood-red eyes not only looking at the house but also taking a look around where he could see from the corner of his eyes at the neighboring houses where some of the families came to take a peek at them. He was well aware of the intrusion that had raised the cautiousness in this village because of his presence. But what he hadn't expected was the eyes that Penny received from her fellow villagers. There were contempt and hate directed towards, which made him wonder why it was so. With what he had heard about her family, her father had run away from his wife and child with no word. Or had disappeared, as Penny had said. But wasn't it a little too much for the villagers to behave this hostile towards Penny? "Look, she's back," both Damien and Penny could the not-so-quiet whispers that went near them. There were 3 women who stood with the baskets that were hitched on the sides of their waist. "Dovico, I thought she wouldn't be back with her mother gone," said another woman. "Look at the strange clothes." "Those are the slave clothes, aren't they?" Murmurs went by as if many could hear the words of the woman that had picked its own wind. "Why do you think she's come here? A girl who has nothing to do with this village, her family not being part of it." Penny didn't mind the words, but she hid her face from Master Damien, whose eyes were on the house but his ears tuned to what the women gossiped about. Damien's eyes moved like a phantom, from one side of the wall to another with a joker-like a face, as if he wanted to hear more on the gossip of what the women at the other side of the house had to speak. When his eyes shifted from the far end of the house to the group of humans who stood there looking at them blatantly until his eyes met his, for them to gossip much quieter, not knowing he could have understood them with his mere observation by reading their movements of the lips. Stupid humans without a pinch of sense in their mind. The woman who stood on the right poked the one next to her as if indicating to move and hurry along after noticing the mad man of a vampire smiling at them. Penny noticed this too and didn't know if it was all right to feel good that the women here were scared of something right now who spoke mindlessly without any certain base. "Do you know where the magistrate's office is?" asked Damien to her, his eyes falling on hers, but Penny was still looking at the women scurrying away. Tearing her eyes away from them, she looked up at him to see a questionable look on his face. "Did their words bother you?" he asked her. Once upon a time, it did. More than what she felt now, as if she wanted to move away from here with her mother, but they had nowhere else to go. People in her, though, who were humans and not vampires, didn't stop in hurting people they could pick on to have their daily sip of gossip and jab for their day to pass by. A smile formed on her lips. "It doesn't anymore." Damien didn't bother to nod or inquire more about it. Penny went to answer his first question. His office and house is the one which is painted blue in color. The one that we passed by after the shop that was closed. The gray shop with a canal of water running behind. Damien had not just followed straight to look at her house, but his eyes had taken in every possible single detail that was in the houses he had come across, which also included the people who Penny and he passed by as they walked. That's the one. Penny wondered how he was able to catch a look of the canal of water which was hidden by the shop along with the other houses. Though Damien had started to walk up the stairs which led to the entrance of the office after reaching the magistrate's office, Penny stood at the ground. Her footsteps had halted before the start of the step. Chapter 77. Round Ball of Waste. Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Note: Top 3 in ranking will have one extra bonus part apart from the regular update by reset time. As the evening was passing by for the night to take over with some of the lanterns which were already burning outside and inside the houses. A lantern was put similarly outside the magistrate's office. Damien, noticing the lack of the presence behind him, turned his face to find Penny, who stood without following him. C.O.C. Ket his head. I want you to collect the keys to your house. Keys. What was he going to do with it? Thought Penny to herself. Follow me, he said before turning his head and reaching the door. The magistrate of the village was a man who had made money by being a fraud and cheating the other villagers who were poorer and could barely reach the taxation that was put up at the center of the village, which was collected once in every month. The man sat on a chair which was made of thick leather, which helped in cushioning his healthy self, which was more than necessary. A thin mustache that was on his upper lips, which looked nothing less to 2 sticks that were placed on either side, as it was straight in nature. Wearing the fur-like coat which he had only bought from the black market at an affordable price, he sat in the cold weather of the Bone Lake while warming his bottom behind his desk, counting the spreadsheet of money which he had drawn upon to see how to swindle more money for himself so that he could fulfill his wife's wishes of buying more jewelry and clothes as she demanded from him. As he calculated the money with a quill in his hand, the front door of his office suddenly burst for a silhouette to stand at the door in the dark, as the face wasn't visible with only half the light of the lantern falling on the person. The magistrate wasn't happy with the sudden outburst of the door, where the imbecile fool of the villager had the audacity to step inside his office without even knocking on the door. It was only a month ago did he punish the man who had even tried to enter the office to negotiate about the taxation and also the repair that was needed for his house. It seemed like threatening the man hadn't been enough. You must have not understood when I said you won't get the funding for the rat-like house of yours, said the magistrate, his eyes still squinting to see the man standing there until the person stepped inside the room. The tall stature of the man baffled the magistrate, who in comparison looked like a heap of a ball. The man wore expensive clothes, but that didn't deter the magistrate of the village. He himself was a rich man, even though his means were crooked. Not letting the man daunt him, who had another person standing right behind him, he asked, "What do you want now?" There was a certain air of arrogance with the question he asked the person who stood in front of him. Penny, who stood behind Damien in the shadow, stayed quiet without a word coming out of her mouth. Having stayed here for many years, she knew the kind of man the magistrate was. It wasn't just her, but a lot of them didn't like the man, but in truth, a lot of people didn't like each other in this village, and there were hardly a few whom she could count in one hand. It seemed like the magistrate had no clue about who Damien was, as he still continued to ask, "Are you going to speak, you ignorant human?" Human. Penny wondered if the man had hit his head across a wall, or if someone had hit him on his head for him to be incapable to see that the man in front of him was not a human but a pure-blooded vampire. She then realized why the man had mistaken Damien to be a human. It was the setting down of evening, where the lantern that was placed on the table didn't reach far enough where Damien stood at the moment. Penny's mouth slightly parted when she heard a gentleman's-like voice come out of Damien's body. "Forgive me for intruding on your time, but one of the village men came to speak to me on how you have been unfair when it came to spending the money for repairing his house." She couldn't believe the way he had decided to play along with 1 second of time by taking in a few words of what the man had just said. She noticed that the magistrate hadn't changed much since she had seen him. On closer observation, she realized she was wrong. He had added a few more kilos to his body, turning himself fatter. The magistrate scoffed, rolling his eyes as the light from the lantern on his table reflected on his chubby face. The villagers forget that I am the one to sanction the money as well as the approval that has to go through me. Bringing a third person who isn't part of it is unnecessary. You can see yourself way out of the room now so that I can get back to my work, said the man, but Damien did not move from there. Isn't it your job to help the villagers? You are their only source of hope, continued Damien with his gentle demeanor, making Penny realize that he was indeed a good actor and wasn't being his narcissist self when he had praised himself. The villagers are born in that life. It is their fate that they live through like this without our help. You go helping every one of them, there won't be any money left to be sent to the council. You refuse to help them, asked Damien, making the man roll his eyes again before dropping the quill that was in his hand on the desk. What did I say about minding your business? You don't have to be rude, Mr. Magistrate. I heard the council provides sufficient money to each of the magistrates for the good fare of the towns and villages they are assigned to. It is the duty of the magistrate to look after and plan for the betterment of what he has been given responsibility with. The magistrate pushed the chair from the desk, letting it creak noisily before he stood up, which pushed the desk forward due to his belly. Do you want me to call the village guards to help you show yourself out? Or will you do it yourself? The magistrate threatened Damien. Penny, who stood behind her master, knew that this was not going to end well. Her master was only playing the man for his own kind of entertainment and amuse.em.e.nt until he would be bored and toss the magistrate out of the street. On second thought, Penny liked the idea of it. For some who had treated her mother and her lowly, torturing them and taking the money and not let them live in peace, this might be an atonement. Chapter 78. Snap of a Twig. Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The light that emitted from the lantern was blocked from spreading further in the room, not because of the magistrate but because the oiled cotton stick had started to reduce. Damien looked at the man who had a round belly with the belt that was worn tightly fitting around his trousers. A furry coat that he wore to cover himself against the cold. Glancing at the fireplace from the corner of his eyes, he caught the last of the woods that were burning bright red and orange in color. It wasn't his first where Damien caught an official making his own money while letting the poor suffer under his guidance. This was the case with a lot of villages compared to the towns, which were comparatively more developed villages. Keeping the sweet demeanor which he had picked up from one of the officials in the council, he continued to speak, seeing the distaste that formed on the magistrate's face. Mr. Linguin, Damien read the name tag that was placed on the desk. If it is money, I will be sure to fund it. This got the magistrate to furrow his brows in question as to why a man who had nothing to do with this village was willing to pay money for someone who was not related to the poor paupers of this village. My father is Mr. Zanulin. I am sure you have heard of him. The magistrate gave it a thought, trying to find the name in his brain, wondering who it might be. By the looks of the clothes that the man in front of him wore, it appeared to be expensive. His cunning eyes looking down at Damien's expensive leather shoes, which looked as if they were only brought yesterday from the store. My father was one of the few men who had helped in the initiative of bringing up the village to some shape. I would be very disheartening if his soul found out in which condition the village was left in. Maybe we both could put the needed money. This was enough for the magistrate to narrow his eyes back at the human in front of him. Nice try, said the man coming around the table, his fingers holding gold rings which had stones fitted into it. If you think I will believe in whatever scam you are trying by pulling out the money, that is not happening. If you have a lot of money, give it to me. I will be sure to put it for good use than spend it on the rats who don't deserve it. Damien took a step forward closer to the man where the magistrate stopped his footstep from moving closer. The uninvited guest, get out of my office now. He raised his hand pointing towards the door. This village doesn't need your charity, so leave right now before I call the guards and put you in the cells, which I am sure you won't like. Don't point your finger blatantly, said Damien, to which the plump man blinked his eyes once and the next second the magistrate screamed in pain, his voice echoing through the cabin of the room while also spilling out the voice outside, which had got some of the nearby villagers' attention. Ah, the man continued to scream. Penny squinted her eyes at the screams that erupted from the magistrate's mouth. What are you doing? Twisting your finger. I guess it wasn't enough of a realization. Damien pondered thoughtfully before twisting the finger further, where the magistrate who had already turned around in pain to feel his finger being more twisted. Stop it. All right, we can split the money. You can put half of it and I can put half of it. We can make the village just like how your father would have wished for it to flourish, said Mr. Linguin, the magistrate who heaved for breath. What Penny didn't understand was that how a simple twist to the finger could cause so much pain that had got the village bully screaming his voice out. She stared at Damien, who looked to be in ease. As if he were waiting for the water to finish boiling, which was placed on top of the fire. The offer has expired. Now I would like you to pay the whole money without you swindling a single penny from the families who live here. At Damien's words the magistrate looked unhappy and shook his face immediately. You think I am stupid? Asked the magistrate, trying to show some defiance in front of Damien with his head that faced in the SM direction as Damien's. How the hell are you this strong? Asked the man, confused. Humans were not even half this strong, which was why the magistrate, who was a half-vampire, was trying to wrap his head around how this fool could have this much power over him when it should have been the other way round. He had been turned by one of the vampires, turning himself from human to a half-vampire who came at the lower level of a vampire and pure-blooded vampire. Why don't you think a little harder? At the word harder, Damien squeezed the man's index finger between his own two fingers with ease, due to which a loud unmanly scream erupted through his thick neck. I have to say, Penny noticed the way Damien's demeanor changed with one feature to another until he was finished with his sentence. For a magistrate you aren't bright, are you? Who appointed you here? Damien tilted his head to his side, looking at the man's face before he dragged him near the lantern and turning Mr. Linguin around so that he could look at his face much more clearly. With the light now that was close to Damien's face, the light reflected back from his face. Mr. Linguin was only trying to catch some air with the man in the front who had not let go of the grip on his finger. He looked up to see his face now that it was close for his small eyes to go wide at the color of his iris. It wasn't black and brown in color but dark red eyes that stared into his. This person wasn't a human but a vampire. Chapter 79. Snap of a Twig. Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Please forgive me for not noticing earlier. The magistrate apologized in haste, but Damien was in no mood to take the apology. Forgive? Asked the pure-blooded vampire innocently. As Damien was part closest to the old lineage of the pure-blooded vampires, it was given that his eyes were a few shades darker than the rest of the vampires. For what? I didn't know you were a pure-blooded vampire. Or the fact that you told me to get out. Damien let out his signature smile, the one like as if he was the most notorious vampire in this land that he walked on. Bad children should be punished, don't you think? What do you think, Penny? Damien asked Penny, who had only been watching until now without speaking a word. Penelope had only planned to watch the show but had no plans to take part in it until Damien had decided to pull her from the shadows. She stepped forward, just one step that let the light touch her body. When the magistrate's eyes fell on Penny, he looked surprised by her presence as if he hadn't expected her to be here. Penelope, said the magistrate, her name rolling on his tongue made her feel disgusted. She tried not to stand in his full view and instead stood behind him. You know her? Asked Damien, intrigue in his eyes as he found the man looking at Penny with fascination. It looks like you are well acquainted with my slave. The word "my" was spoken with a little more pressure, which made the magistrate snap his eyes back at the pure-blooded vampire. Slave? Asked Mr. Linguin, shocked at the revelation. Penny had dreaded when Damien had first asked her about the magistrate and his office. Since the time she could remember, this man had done nothing but leeched on to her and her mother when it came to leaving shameful remarks. Not to forget that particular day where he had done no justice at all. She still remembered that day as if the memory was brightly burned into her mind. It was noon that was cloudy with the ground wet with slippery mud. Penny was on her way back home when she was caught amidst two drunk men who had tried to misbehave with her. While she had only tried to leave the place as quick as possible, a woman who was passing by only accused of wrongdoings, turning all the fault to her. Burn her. Kill her. Trying to lure men in broad light, shame on the girl for dragging our village's name down. She's a witch and so is her mother. Look at the way they look. Stake them, a man screamed in the crowd. Put her and her mother away. The voices still resonated in her ears like it was still going on as they were now in the very same village. The magistrate back then and even now hadn't changed much. He had offered to counsel her as it wouldn't be right to throw two females out of the village. He had called her to this very cabin. She could still feel his disgusting hands that had touched her thigh to move up. Penny had been too shocked before she realized and pushed him away. His hands trying to touch her where she had screamed to only be slapped before being sent out. Things had turned even far worse after last year with what had taken place. The only thankful thing was that she worked in the theater which was part of the next 2 towns away, where the villagers here didn't go. While Penny was drowned with the memories she had tried to forget, the magistrate was in his own thoughts as he looked at the pale-looking girl. Her beautiful green eyes that looked like liquid glass shining across from where she stood. Many men and women claimed that the daughter and the mother were witches with their unusual jade. Like green eyes that stood out when compared to the rest of the people who lived in the village with brown and black eyes, with only a few different colors. But that wasn't what stood out the most. It was their feature and daunting features which even made the magistrate doubt, but the man knew better than the illiterate peasants who knew nothing about the world outside than their own village. The magistrate could have been considered to her father's age, but he didn't find it wrong to make his moves on the poor girl when she used to live here. Wanting to take advantage of her and her body. It was unfortunate that after her mother's death he had already started to devise a plan on what he wanted and how he would approach the girl again. He had readied himself to get Penelope's mother's body to be burnt in front of everyone in the village, which would weaken her soul and would need a comforting touch that he himself could provide. But what the magistrate didn't know was that the girl had another family who would take her from here. To make sure she would have a reason to return back, he had got her mother buried in here with the rest of them, even though many of the villagers didn't like the idea of it. And she finally did come near the village, but she had turned to a slave. If he knew it, he would have brought her from the slavery himself. The magistrate couldn't believe his bad luck. With the 2 people, the magistrate and Penny, who were thinking about each other, Damien heard and noticed every movement as well as the beat of the hearts that passed like a ticking watch. He didn't need Penny to tell him that something was wrong. He had guessed it right away when she had stopped from stepping on the stairs of the magistrate's office. Damien caught sight of every single emotion that came to pass like weather that was changing every few seconds. Shock, disappointment, lustl.u. S.T. Damien thought to himself before his fingers squished the other man's index finger before a pop was heard, which was due to the top bone of the finger which had turned to a powder. Ah! The man screamed in the anguish of pain. Chapter 80. Snap of a Twig. Part 3. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Hearing the crack and pop sound made Penny's eyes snap from looking at the man's finger, which he now embraced as he fell on the floor with his back against the table, whining and his face in pain. Penny's eyes moved from the magistrate to Damien, who had a calm and collected expression as if he hadn't even touched the person and had caused an immense as well as excruciating pain. It seemed that Damien's favorite torturable part in a body were the fingers. The sound in the room where the sky had turned dark and cold, she could feel her heart racing, but it wasn't out of fear but the shock. With the way Grace had turned and twisted her arm, she knew to some extent that the pure-blooded vampires were strong, but to pop a human's bone with just 2 fingers. That would have been unbelievable before, but now that she had witnessed it, her body slightly trembled at the thought of if she would still be having an arm if Grace had put some more pressure and if Damien hadn't come down in time. Damien looked around the room, his eyes roaming before it settled on the magistrate. Where are the keys to the houses? Seeing the magistrate still in pain where he failed to answer, he turned over his shoulder to look at Penny, who looked petrified. Looking back in the front, he walked around the table, opening the drawers one after another as he rummaged through them until he finally opened the last drawer where the keys were placed on the hooks. What's the lock on the house? Penny first thought that Damien was asking her the question, but he wasn't asking her but Mr. Linguin, who was still on the floor. Sighing, Damien rubbed the bridge of his nose before kicking the table, which got the magistrate in an alert position. What's her house lock number? You must have changed it, right? It was a common work in every town and village when the house was acquisitioned back in the magistrate's hand. It was a routine to change the locks so that the house would not be used by others by breaking into the house with the older lock and keys. It is 20.3, huffed the man for air, getting up from the wooden floor with great difficulty. As Damien hummed softly, picking out the key, he closed the drawer with a small bang. Thanks. What about the deal? Asked the magistrate when Damien started to leave. Damien's hand tinkled softly with the 2 keys that he held in his hand. What about it? The magistrate looked at him with a bewildered expression. The half, he started to only be cut off by the pure-blooded vampire as he waved his hand. The case has been dismissed. Now if you want the rest of your fingers to have bones in there, make sure to fix that attitude of yours. Yes. I knew you would listen. There is no violence needed at all, said Damien. He walked to the door, opening the knob and stepping out, who was followed shortly by Penny, as she didn't want to stay in here a second longer alone with the magistrate. But when they stepped out, Penny could see the number of people who had come to surround near the office of the magistrate, while also keeping a safe distance from the unknown vampire and the girl who was shunned. All Damien had to do was look at the people around to send them stumbling and scurrying back to their houses, shutting and closing the windows and doors. Pathetic humans who derived pleasure from others' misfortune, thought Damien as he made his way back to the house with Penny, who was a step away from him. He handed her the key, asking her to open it, which she did. Picking up the lantern which hung outside, Damien shook it to feel the weight of the oil which must have still been there after all this time. While Penny stepped inside the dark house, which was quite small, he plucked the dried-up cotton, dipping it in the oil before pulling out a matchstick which he had stolen from the magistrate's office. Lighting the lantern up, he handed it to Penny for her to carry. Placing his hands in the trouser of his pocket, he looked at the house, which could hardly be called a house as it wasn't even half of the size of his room. It was empty. Damien asked her, what happened to all the things in here? I sold them before going to stay with my aunt and uncle. She saw him nod as he looked at the walls and the ceiling. She stared at Damien enough for him to notice without looking at her to ask, you keep looking at me like that and I am going to get another meaning from it. Penny quickly turned her head to look away from him to see the empty space. With her mother gone and also the scarce furniture that was there was nothing much remaining in her except for the hollow and empty space which filled up her heart with. Do you regret moving out of here? He asked her, curious, his eyes falling upon her to see her looking at nothing in particular as they were surrounded by the walls. No, she responded back with a whisper in her voice. This was hell compared to the life she had now. Trying to shift the topic, she asked him, aren't you worried that he's going to complain against what you just did to his direct superior? What is that? He asked in a murmur before saying, are you worried for your master, little mouse? He teased her. I was only wondering, she pressed her lips. It seemed like Damien didn't worry about it, as he hardly had cared about the man's finger which he had turned to dust.